Today we will learn about 3 different important Supreme Court case decisions. Supreme Court cases are named for the 2 main people involved in the case. For example, a case named Smith v. Jones would involve one person with the last name Smith against another person with the last name Jones. Versus means against or in opposition to. And in a Supreme Court case, versus is usually abbreviated as a V between 2 names. The first Supreme Court case we will learn about today is Dred Scott v. Sanford. This case took place in 1857. Dred Scott was an enslaved African American who was living in Missouri, a slave state. In 1834, Scott's owner took him to Illinois, a free state. They then moved to the Upper Louisiana Territory and present-day Minnesota, where slavery was also forbidden. In 1838, Scott and his owner returned to Missouri, which was still a slave state. After his owner's death, Scott sued his owner's widow for his freedom. He argued that he was free because he had lived in a state that outlawed slavery. The state court ruled in Scott's favor, but the Missouri Supreme Court disagreed and reversed the decision. Dred Scott's lawyers took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that Scott could not bring a legal lawsuit to a federal court. According to the Supreme Court, African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, were not United States citizens at the time the Constitution was adopted. They argued that the only real U.S. citizens were descendants of people who were citizens when the Constitution was adopted, or immigrants who had become citizens through naturalization. The court also said that Congress could not forbid slavery in United States territories like the Upper Louisiana Territory where Dred Scott had lived. This decision caused great outrage among those against slavery and added to the tension across the United States that led to the Civil War. 11 years later, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment states, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." This guarantees citizenship to all people of all races who are born in the United States. This amendment reversed the Dred Scott decision because it clearly states that if you are born in the United States, you are considered a citizen. The next case we will study is Plessy v. Ferguson. This case took place in 1896. Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 African American and 7/8 Caucasian, rode in a whites-only train car and was arrested. Plessy argued that segregation laws forcing him to ride in a separate train car violated the 14th Amendment, because as a U.S. citizen, he should be equally protected under the laws and enjoy all the privileges of citizenship. The Supreme Court ruled against Homer Plessy, arguing that states had the right to segregate, in other words, separate people of different races, as long as the separate accommodations for each race were equal. They felt that Plessy wasn't being discriminated against by being banned from the whites-only train car, because he could ride in the African American train car. This decision came to be known as the separate but equal doctrine. Using the Plessy v. Ferguson case as a precedent, schools, restaurants, movie theaters, buses, and other public accommodations in the United States became segregated. The last case we will study today is Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka. This case took place in 1954. Linda Brown was an 8-year-old African American girl who could not attend her neighborhood school because it was an all-white school. Instead, she had to walk through a dangerous railroad yard to a bus stop and then take the bus to the nearest African American elementary school. Her father, Oliver Brown, sued the school district of Topeka, Kansas, arguing that the 14th Amendment was being broken because his daughter was not being equally protected under the law. This time, the Supreme Court agreed. They argued that separate schools for blacks and whites could never be equal, and segregation denied African Americans equal protection under the law. This case began the long process of desegregating the United States. Not everyone agreed with the Supreme Court's decision. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 African American students were scheduled to attend the city's formerly all-white high school. The state governor disagreed with desegregation and called the state's National Guard to block the students' entry into the school. President Dwight Eisenhower responded by sending federal troops into the city to escort the black students to school. The state finally backed down and allowed the students to enter. Brown v. the Board of Education opened the door for many more court cases dealing with equal rights. It established a precedent for the court to strike down segregation in public parks, beaches, playgrounds, and elsewhere. This case is noted as one of the most important in United States history. In fact, one of the Supreme Court justices on the case, Stanley Reed, once said, "If it was not the most important decision in the history of the court, it was very close."